welcome to my workshop. This is Kelly from Kelly's Creative Comforts. Today I want to show you a folding method to be able to cut bias binding strips from any size piece of fabric. Probably the hardest part about cutting bias binding is the fact that the binding needs to be cut on a 45-degree angle. So you either need a really big cutting space and a really big ruler or smaller pieces of fabric. Now I have a king-size quilt that I need to bind, and it has to be biased because it's got some curved edges, and I don't want to sew together a whole bunch of little tiny strips to make the binding. So when I need a lot of binding, like I do to bind this king-size quilt, I want to start with a much bigger piece of fabric. So to make binding with big long strips, I need to be able to fold my fabric. So today I'm going to show you that folding technique so that you can take any size piece of fabric and easily cut it on the bias without having to have any special tools other than your regular rotary cutting tools. And you don't need a whole lot of space to be able to do it either. So I'm going to show you this technique first on this fat quarter, and then I will show it on the big piece of fabric that I have underneath. So first thing I do before I fold my fabric is I give it a good press so it's nice and flat. I remove the salvage, and this was the salvage end on this fat quarter. And I have also made sure that my fabric is square. So to do that, I'll rip off the side, make a little slit, rip it off, and that puts my fabric into straight of grain. I do know that my fabric is square. All right, so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this corner down here, and I want to bring it in so that it is in line with this edge right here. So now this is my bias edge, and it's a true bias, which is a 45 degree. So I want to keep this edge always lined up on itself because this would be where I would cut. So if I was using, this is just a fat quarter, and already if I was just to cut this with a ruler, I already need a much longer ruler, and this is just a fat quarter. So this is what we're trying to stop from happening, that we don't have to use a really long ruler. So then I'm going to take this corner here and I'm going to bring it down, and I'm using my hand just to make sure that we don't get any wrinkles and that the fabric still lays smooth underneath here. And I have folded the bias edge. So this was my bias edge. I've folded it onto itself. So right now I have the two folds right here, and we're still on the bias edge. And then if it's still too big for my ruler, I can fold it again. So here's all my bias edges lined up on top of one another, right here. And I can then just go ahead, cut those folds off, and then continue with my bias cuts. So here I am with my 1 meter piece of fabric. Now you can see that this piece of fabric is even too big for my sewing table, my cutting table. So I would have a devil of a time trying to cut this up this way on the 45 just using a ruler. It doesn't take me very long before my ruler is way too short for this piece of fabric. So the folding technique means that I can use my regular ruler, I can use my regular size cutting board, and I don't have to have any special tools. In preparing the fabric, I have cut the salvages off. So this is my salvage end, and I've cut it off. And I have made sure that my fabric is on the straight of grain just by ripping the edge and making sure it lays flat, and I have pressed it. So what I'm going to do, my first fold, I'm going to fold it kind of so you can see from your end. So this is the salvage edge right here, and I am going to take that salvage edge, and it doesn't matter if if I go this way or if I happen to be left-handed and go this way, it doesn't matter. I also want to make sure that the fabric, the good side is down. I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to take this and bring this over. See if I can show you that a little better this way. There. So I have lined the fabric up on this edge right here, made sure that I'm nice and straight right there, and then just smoothed out my bias. So this right here is my bias edge. This is the edge that I want to maintain. This is the edge that I want to cut. So every time I fold the fabric, I folded the bias on top of itself. So my next fold, I'm going to take this corner right here, and I'm going to bring it down so that I have lined it up. This way, I've got my bias edges lined up on top of themselves, And it's still too big for me to cut with my ruler. So I am going to fold it again, like this. Smooth everything out. Make sure that my bias edges are on top of themselves. And then I am ready to cut. Okay, now that I have it all lined up this way, my first cut is going to be to get rid of all these folded edges. So this is my bias edge. So I'm going to line my ruler up so that I'm straight along here and I'm straight down here at the bottom. And I'm going to make that first cut. Now I'm going through quite a few layers here, so I do want to make sure my blade is nice and sharp. And I don't want my ruler to move, so I'm moving my hand along as I cut. And then I can just discard that edge right there. Now I don't want to disturb this edge. I've got this beautiful, perfect little edge. So I can either spin my mat like so, or I can very carefully pick that fabric up and move it so that I can cut the rest of the fabric. Now I like a 2.5 inch binding, so I'm gonna line my ruler up on the 2.5 inch, and I'm gonna go ahead and cut. Now that gives me a nice, great big long piece of bias that I can then sew together, and I don't have a whole lot of little pieces. So I'm going to continue cutting my bias, and then when you are finished cutting your bias, you just sew it together like regular binding. Press it and apply it like regular binding. So there's no difference in how you apply the binding. The difference is just in how you cut the binding. So you can cut however many strips you need. Now the math on figuring out bias binding is probably the trickiest part, and there's a link to that in the description of the video. Now that you have your binding cut, if you need a tutorial on how to apply binding, check out these 2 videos that I have made on applying binding. Thanks very much for watching this video. Now, off to the sewing machine because I've got that king-size quilt to bind. If you like what you see, please consider hitting that subscribe button and join me for some more videos. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Kelly from Kelly's Creative Comforts. Happy sewing!